Chapter 17, Cochin Harbor Terminus. We have another example of the constant attention to little lives with the sparrow that had died on the backseat of the car on page 280. This text, it's very egalitarian in its care for life. We learn that Father Mulligan died 4 years previous. And we learn that Baby Kochama has written every night, night after night, year after year, in diary after diary, she wrote, "I love you, I love you." So maybe a little opening for some sympathy. And one of the things I'm sorry we're not going to get to discuss in person is the characterization of Baby Kochama and where there's any sympathy for her in this text. We talked a little bit in the beginning about the pretty almost cruel mocking descriptions of her, which to me is a little jarring in a book that purportedly part of the text is caring about all lives. We have Estha on page 283, Estha and Rahel's very physical awareness of each other, and then on 284, the, I find, incredibly painful description of when Estha was returned. So right after the death of Sophie Ball, when it was decided he had to be sent away, and that scene in the train station, which I find really, really difficult to read. And then by the end of the chapter, we have the touchable policeman crossing the river. And okay, I'm super annoyed because I recorded everything for the last 4 chapters and I pressed the wrong button, so it didn't record. So in case you've missed my problems with technology, there you go. It's still happening. Okay, so I did have lunch, so I'm fortified for this. All right. The last 4 chapters, we're marching toward the end of the book. So chapter 18, of course, the History House. This is where we finally have to live what happened to Velutha. And from the very first chapter, with the smell of 6 sweet roses, that's this blood smell from Velutha and the brutal beating that the touchable policemen give him. And by the way, it's interesting they're called touchable policemen sometimes because touchable, you wouldn't normally indicate that. It's a negative. You name it if somebody's untouchable. So calling them touchable policemen is a way of kind of underscoring the labeling, categorization of people. This, needless to say, this description of what they do to him is incredibly graphic and very brutal. But it's interesting, and if you were writing about this in a passage-based essay on the exam, and they would never have you write about something this R-rated, but it's that the prose is actually very controlled, very calm. And so, for example, the absence of caprice, this is page 292, in what the policeman did, the abyss where anger should have been, the sober, steady brutality, the economy of it all. They were opening a bottle or shutting a tap, cracking an egg to make an omelet. So you have a lot of short, controlled sentences, and a sort of almost not quite affectless delivery, but what do you think that's doing? You know, what is the point of that? Is that perhaps conveying the sort of the callousness of these forces of history, these policemen who are carrying out their sort of prescribed social duty, as it were. And the children, of course, are witnessing all of this. In chapter 19, this is the chapter where the plot all comes together. They go to the police station, and the children, specifically Estha, is pressured into identifying Velutha as having abducted them, as Baby Kochama has claimed. So, and that finishes the circle from Baby Kochama's resentment of being embarrassed when they're stuck in the car during the march, and Velutha sees her humiliation and she associates him with that. So on the bottom of page 303, the inspector asked his question. As the smile said yes. Childhood tiptoed out. Silence slid in like a bolt. Someone switched off the light and Velutha disappeared. So Essa has effectively completed the killing of Velutha by saying yes. And now we know exactly why Essa doesn't speak at all. And that's when his silence began. And that is also then the children's role in this is what leads to Essa being returned. Okay, so in the Madras Mail chapter, I may have mentioned this in a previous moment. I find it excruciating to read this description of the children being separated. And of course, they are like one, right? They're supposed to be together. And again, we have to keep in mind the partition of Pakistan and India, and that is an underlying preoccupation of the novel, which we partly know a little bit cheating through knowing about Roy and her concerns. But this is the scene where they're divided. On page 309, little Elvis the pelvis with a spoiled special outing puff and beige and pointy shoes. He left his voice behind. On the station platform, Rahel doubled over and screamed and screamed. The train pulled out, the light pulled in. So we have the destruction of Velutha and his body, right? Then we have this ripping apart of the twins, which is another unnatural thing, obviously of a different type. Then we have the two sort of love scenes at the end of the book. So I have to address these. And this is what I'm frustrated to have to re-record because it's hard to talk about. So students always ask, did they really do what I think they did about Essa and Rahel? And I have to say, yes, they did. Yes, they did. So the fact that Essa and Rahel commit incest, the word commit, right? Interesting. That's very cultural. That word says a lot. That triggers one of the deepest taboos in our cultural context: incest. Okay, people respond to this with revulsion, with disgust. I had a student once annotated, "I refuse to read this. This is filth," and quite likely some of you felt the same way. The final scene in the book, right, which is the love scene between Velutha and Amu, the first time they're together, that, even though it's way more detailed and graphic than we usually read in books for school, so it's a little squirmy, maybe a little cringy because of that. But in general, in my experience, students have celebrated that they're together. This is love, and they transgress, they break the love laws. But this is something that we are encouraged to celebrate in our culture, right? The idea that people who love each other shouldn't be kept apart because of class or ethnicity, in this case, caste. So the book is challenging I'll say broadly, the Western reader here with these taboos, challenging the reader in India. People were not happy. I've mentioned this in the past. The book was received with outrage because of not as much the Rahel Essa scene, but the Amu Velutha scene. That is what really upset people in India. And because that violation of caste law, even though caste was made illegal a long time ago, this cuts right at the heart of taboos just as deeply seated as those against incest in India. So bear in mind, as you have your responses, perhaps visceral responses to these two scenes, that as we pride ourselves on being open-minded, right, and this idea of these arbitrary love laws, we may sniff at that everyone should be able to love everyone. Well, really, how open-minded are we going to be about that? The other thing to bear in mind is that the book's concern with boundaries, blurring boundaries, and the unnatural separation of things that belong together, that this union of Rahel and Esta, if you read back to the beginning, this is the end of that arc. So we're bringing things that should be together that were split apart back together. Okay, so try to accept the challenge of stepping outside of our own taboos for a moment. All right, and I appreciate that the book ends with love scenes. It started with the initial concern at the beginning of the first chapter was maybe this goes back to when the love laws were laid down that said who could love whom and how. And so to have the book circle back around to the two scenes of the two primary violations of the love laws that happen to our main characters is I'm not going to say sweet, but I think a very poetically fitting ending. So we have become very accustomed to texts that end in violence, right? When we think about climactic scenes, it's often a scene of violence. But we had the violence, the physical violence with Velutha, then we had the violence of dividing the twins, and then we have the two love scenes. And I appreciate, I have some issues with this novel, but I appreciate that it ends with those love scenes, and particularly in its own strange way has a happy ending. She had a dry rose in her hair. She turned to say it once again, Nele, tomorrow. So it ends with lovers who are going to be together again tomorrow. And we know their tomorrows are very limited, but it does end with that sort of a very beautiful moment. Remember back also at the beginning of the novel how it questioned, where do stories start, right? Where do they start? How can we say where they start? How can we say where they end? It seems very arbitrary. And one of the things we do in fiction is we create these sort of, we construct beginnings and endings. So that's a little reminder too of how much of the ending of fiction is this sort of artificial construction. And so if the book wants to end on this happy moment, it can, even though we know everything that's going to end. And the real happy ending is the one that's difficult for a lot of us to stomach, which is Esta and Rahel being back together. So thank you for listening. If you made it this far, hope you listened. I entreat you to share your questions on the comments stream, questions, comments, etc. Please make them thoughtful, please make them critical and reflective. And if you have questions or comments you want to share privately with me, totally fine. But as much as you're willing, please share them with the class, because everybody benefits from questions, observations, connections, insights. Okay? Thank you so much. Hope you're doing well. I hope I managed to record this time. All right. Bye.